Hi, I'm Freddie Myers and I'm the musical director of Bandwidth. Today I'd like to talk to you about what it means to be a musical director in the online environment, a space where it doesn't seem very natural to have a conductor.
1, 2,
3.
The idea of a musical director often has connotations of some level of authorship for the ensemble. So the musical director of a professional orchestra would choose the program, would have some say in the soloists, and it's their responsibility to then make that happen with the group. I suppose with Bandwidth, in a way, I do exactly the same thing. I choose what we're going to play, who's going to play it, and then I'm in charge of making that happen. I suppose deciding on repertoire is the same with a normal musical director. However, of course, I can't choose exactly what I want to play, but I have to pick pieces that will work well in this new online environment. Something like a Beethoven symphony is incredibly poorly designed for playing in an online environment. However, we've quite often found that slightly more unusual Baroque music, bits of French Romantic music, slightly more obscure things tend to work well. There's a research part of the repertoire deciding process where not only do I decide what would be a nice piece for us to play, but also I have to decide what would be an appropriate piece to play. I'm very lucky that I'm a composer just finishing off my Masters at the Royal Academy of Music, and so quite a lot of my colleagues who, like everyone at the moment, doesn't have any work, are quite keen to do some writing, so I've had the chance to commission some of my friends, and I'm really hoping that in the future Bandwidth will have a dual relationship where it performs music that's old, but also that performs newly commissioned works, and we can sort of experiment with both sides of the online environment. Unlike a normal musical director, with Bandwidth I have to arrange any music we play that's not written specifically for us. And this is a process that actually has a lot of creative sides to it. There's the obvious one, that's the orchestration. So if you take the masho that we did, that was originally for 4 singers, and then I had to decide what instruments I just wanted to use, and also how I'd go about marrying up slightly disparate sounds. I mean, for that we used a double bass, a viola, cor anglais, clarinet and piano, and trying to find a space between the double bass and the viola to make that actually work was a bit fiddly sometimes with ranges. Aside from the obvious idea about what instrument plays what, I've also got to decide how an old piece is going to work in time. Obviously, any music pre-1900 is going to be synchronized, and so whatever we do with Bandwidth, that synchronicity is going to be lost to some extent. But we still try and find a flow through the music. My job as the arranger is to actually decide who's listening to who and who's leading who, and how each musician navigates their space. In the Jaquette de la Guerre piece that was arranged a while ago, I felt like there was a single melodic line that sort of spread throughout the whole piece. And that was quite a useful thing to then hang the harmony off of. So this melody line starts off in the cello, and then it passes between the different instruments. And then everyone has in their parts that melody line. And when they hear the certain part they're meant to be playing against, they then play their chords. So it's sort of led by the melody, and then people follow along. In the masho, we had a very different process where certain chords were unifying points. There were certain moments where everyone came together, and then there were melodic sections, and that was completely free rein. People were asked to just be as melodic as possible, be as expressive as possible, and then once you got to the chord, wait till everyone's there. Once everyone's there, then move on. A lot of these ideas are conveyed in the score and the notation, but as a conductor, though I'm not beating time, I can talk about expression and talk about how I want people to perform things. Going back to the idea of synchronization, exactly how long we spend on a note and how we wait and how we pause is actually really important in this environment. In that masho, do we get to a pause? Do we hold it for 2 seconds? Do we then move on? Or do you, as soon as you've played your long note, as soon as you hear everyone on the long note, do you move on? I think the momentum management in these pieces is really important. And when we perform them, we tend to do a lot of rehearsal beforehand, working out how we're going to manage just how fast we move through the pieces, because that's not something that's sort of determined by one person universally. We all actually have to have a conversation about how we want the piece to move. I suppose as a rehearser, I also have to manage the rehearsal time and work out solutions. So when we were doing the Ravel frontispiece, we actually had a problem that Source Connect wasn't working that day and we had to use Zoom. And the problem with Zoom is that it just destroys any distinction between players. As such, the cues that were in the parts were actually very difficult to be heard, and so it was my job to work out how we were going to rework that. We eventually realised that everyone made it to a repeating pattern in the last bar of the first section, and that we could use that as a sort of loop section until the second violin did a cue and everyone would cut, and it would give exactly the same impression as had everyone actually been able to hear each other. So those sort of on-the-fly decisions can actually have somewhat of an impact on how the piece comes together and how it's shaped. But what's quite nice actually is that the performance is not actually about me, in a way that I think conductors can sometimes really get in the way of an orchestra. They stand up the front, it's about them. And quite often the musicians aren't following them at all. Whether or not the musicians want to follow what I'm doing, it doesn't matter, because I'm not involved in the actual performance, and it's a way of showcasing performers. You know, we're all split into our different spaces, and we really are all individuals when we're performing in the online environment. I suppose the last creative aspect of my job is that of an editor. It's sort of my responsibility once rehearsals are over to actually edit all of the footage together. And that's not a trivial process, because we tend to do a clap when we're doing rehearsals to give us a synchronization point. So that clap is actually a different place for everyone in the ensemble. And when I get all the footage together, I actually have to sort of piece together who's listening to what part and how I'm going to sort of arrange all of the clips in time. And actually this can be quite an interesting process, and it can elicit actually a slightly different musical experience depending on whether someone's responding to one thing or whether actually they're coincident with it, as well as actually deciding how exactly in time the final piece will look. I also have to design how it looks on the screen. I think that can have quite a big impact on at least how engaging the musical performance is. It can be interesting to sometimes include scores, and I think when you have manuscripts of some of the earlier music, it's really beautiful to actually include that in the piece. But whether you're interested in letting the audience be aware of the process, or whether you want them to be kept inside the music, or how you want them to engage with this piece that you've done. I mean, you have all of that control when you're actually producing the video. So I sort of have this weird role where the whole thing is my creation, but the music itself is facilitated by other people. I think musical director is perhaps the closest thing to capture what I do. I've sort of described a lot of roles here, which could very well be done by different people. I mean, I could be the conductor, and then we could have someone else edit, and then we could have someone else arrange the music, and someone else decide what we were going to play. But I think you would end up with a product that was not very unified, and actually Bandwidth as my creative venture. I mean, really, I think my own expression is in the way that all of those peripheral parts work together, and how I go about facilitating all of this music to happen online. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Bandwidth to keep updated with all of our latest performances.